psychological cat and mouse story about guilt. Just
this is in like 1864, 1865, and Edwin Booth grabbed the 21-year-old Robert Lincoln by the collar and pulled him back to safety. And Robert recognized the famous actor and was like, "Oh, did you just save me? Thank you so much." And Edwin didn't even realize whose son that he had rescued until much later. So yeah, one Booth literally saved Lincoln, and the other one killed Lincoln, which is just another crazy thread in the story. Another crazy fun fact in this whole saga: the only time that all three Booths, like Junius, the father, Edwin, and John Wilkes Booth, all played and performed together was in a production of Shakespeare's Julius Caesar in November 1860. And John Wilkes Booth is really the character in the play who avenges Caesar's assassination. So just as like the foreshadowing, like all the parallels are just instant. But anyway, basically, John Wilkes Booth created the first plan, and this was a kidnapping. So by late 1864, the Confederacy is losing the war, and Booth is spiraling, so he comes up with this plan. And we're just going to kidnap Lincoln, we're going to blackmail the Union, convince them to exchange prisoners of war for his return, and we'll continue the Confederate effort. And this is when everything begins to fall in place. He gathers a crew at a D.C. boarding house run by a lady named Mary Surratt. This was a widowed businesswoman who, basically her house became like, the headquarters for like Confederate sympathizers, and just like conspiracy headquarters. So Booth is then introduced to John Surratt. This is Mary's son and a Confederate courier. So literally a man who was like delivering messages into the South, from the South himself. He became sort of like a conduit. And they met through a man named Dr. Samuel Mudd, who was going to become important later for the Lincoln. Booth kept on asking Surratt about trails leading from Washington to the Potomac River without telling him why he wanted information. But when Surratt finally demanded to know what Booth wanted after weeks of avoiding questions, Booth basically reveals his plan to kidnap the president, take him to Richmond, and exchange him for thousands of Confederate prisoners. Now the team for this whole operation consisted of a few. David Harold, who was John Wilkes Booth's sidekick, he was like a 22-year-old pharmacist assistant who basically followed him everywhere and knew the back roads of Southern Maryland on hunting trips. He had Lewis Powell, who at the time was learning about Lewis Payne, who was an ex-Confederate soldier, who was just like a big, dominant head type guy. He was also a former member of Mosby's Rangers, who was wounded at Gettysburg, and again, just kind of like an adult. And then you had George Atzerodt, who was the getaway guy. Now, he was a German immigrant, basically, who was like repairing carriages as a job. And despite living in America, most was like, couldn't really speak English. So this is the squad. This is the crackpot team that's going to be kidnapped. Okay? So Booth basically rehearsed practice runs in the back roads of Maryland, and the conspirators basically were like stocking ropes and chloroform and pistols, and they were putting all this stuff in the attic of the Surratt attic, basically this woman and her son. But the issue was that they didn't know how to actually do it. So they made a bunch of different scenarios. One insane idea was to kidnap him from the theater, tie him up, and then lower him from the balcony to the stage, and then take him from the stage out of the theater. But then that plan didn't really shape up for obvious reasons. So then they planned to ambush Lincoln's carriage as he would return from the play. But to their luck, he changed his schedule at the last minute and escaped Washington. So after weeks of failed attempts, Booth's plan was falling apart, and the Confederate effort was falling apart even more. And then came the final blow, April 9, 1865. Robert E. Lee surrenders to General Ulysses S. Grant at Appomattox Courthouse, and the South is done. It's over. The Southern resistance is done for, and the Union is won. And this causes Booth to basically freak out and change the plan from kidnapping, because now he doesn't have any more leverage because the war is basically done, and he wants to do something much harder: assassination. So when they gathered for a second attempt in early April, Booth basically told them the new plan, and the goal was now to murder the president and at least 3 other Northern leaders. They wanted to kill Vice President Andrew Johnson, Secretary of State William Seward, and Ulysses S. So, fast forward 5 days, now it's April 14th, and Lincoln wants a night off. Lucky for him, the Ford Theater is having a play called Our American Cousin. This is like a British comedy. Now, originally the Lincolns were supposed to be joined by Ulysses S. Grant and his wife Julia. But Julia and Mary Lincoln weren't really getting along at the time, so, of course, Ulysses and his wife backed out, fortunately for them. Lincoln then invites Major Henry Rathbone and his fiancée Clara Harris, who had accepted the invitation. That night, Mary developed a headache and wanted to stay home, but Lincoln said newspapers had already announced his attendance, so he couldn't miss it. He told his bodyguard, William Crook, "It has been advertised that we will be there, and I cannot disappoint the people, otherwise I will not go." So, I mean, fellas, if your lady's complaining about a headache, doesn't want to go to something, just hear her out. It might be a gift from God, maybe a sign from God. That's all I'm saying. Okay? Because what happens next, I think basically. That afternoon, John Wilkes Booth stopped by Ford's Theater to pick up his mail. Again, he's performing at the theater all the time. His mail is getting sent directly to the theater. And this is something that he did often, right? So while chatting with the staff, he learned that Lincoln and Grant were expected that evening. Although at the time, he didn't know that Grant was backing out. So he met with his co-conspirators around 8:45 p.m. to finalize the plot. Booth would sneak in and assassinate Lincoln. Lewis Powell would attack Secretary of State William Seward, and then George Atzerodt would then kill Vice President Andrew Johnson at the Kirkwood Hotel. And David Harold was basically to guide Powell to the home of Seward, and then they would meet Booth at a point in Maryland, and then they would all escape. And the goal was ultimately to decapitate the Union government in one coordinated strike every major power player gone. The Lincolns arrived at the theater a little bit late, but despite that, when they entered their presidential box, the entire audience, roughly 1,700 people, rise to their feet, and the orchestra orchestra starts playing Hail to the Chief as Lincoln sat in his famous rocking chair. He sits down, and again, the energy in the theater is just electric. Everyone's like, we did it, the Union won, the good guys triumphed, like equality in America is like finalized, like there's no more like this is great, everyone's feeling so good. Mary Lincoln held her husband's hand during the show, and it said that she asked him, what will Miss Harris think of my hanging on to you so? And Lincoln smiled and said, she won't think anything about it. Those would be his last known words. Now normally Lincoln had strong protection, but again, this was prior to Secret Service, but typically, large, prominent heads of state would have some type of security. But that night, his security was a disaster. His regular bodyguard, the Star Ward Hill Landon, was away in Richmond, and William Crook had the day off. Again, everyone's like, dude, the war's over, the good guys won, let's just move on, it's fine. The man in charge was Officer John Frederick Parker, but Parker had a reputation for being unreliable. He had a bunch of different disciplinary write-ups, even before ever being assigned to guard the president. And on this day, he arrived 3 hours late to his shift, and during intermission, he left the presidential box unguarded to go drink at the Star Saloon next door, which coincidentally is the same bar Booth was hanging out before the assassination. At around 10:10 p.m., Booth entered through the front door of the theater and made his way to the upper level and actually handed Lincoln's valet, this guy Charles Forbes, his calling card in order to access the box. And remember, he knew the layout of the theater perfectly. He had been there thousands of times. And another wild fun fact, earlier that day, when he was getting his mail, John Wilkes Booth drilled the people into the door of the presidential box so that he could actually peep inside without actually going in and seeing if the president was really there. Booth then wedged a wooden stick behind the outer door to block the access from anyone entering. And he waited for the loudest laugh in the play when actor Harry Hawk said, "Don't know the manners of a good society, eh? Well, I guess I know enough to turn you inside out, old gal. You sock-dozing old man trap." At that moment, the audience burst into laughter. Lincoln himself is said to have been laughing. And at that exact moment, 10:15 p.m., Booth stepped forward and fired a single shot, a .41 caliber Derringer, into the back of Abraham Lincoln's head. The bullet entered behind his left ear and lodged near the front of his skull. Lincoln then slumped forward, and Major Rathbone turned to see Booth and lunged at him, but Booth pulled out a knife and stabbed him in the arm before leaping 12 feet from the box to the stage. When the bullet entered, burst into laughter. Lincoln himself is said to have been laughing, and at that exact moment, 10:15 p.m., Booth stepped forward and fired his single shot off, a .41 caliber Derringer, into the back of Abraham Lincoln's head. The bullet entered behind his left ear and lodged near the front of his skull. Lincoln then slumped forward, and Major Rathbone turned to see Booth and lunged at him, but Booth pulled out a knife and stabbed him in the arm before leaping 12 feet from the box to the stage. When Booth jumped, his spur actually caught the flag that was draped over the box, and then he landed and broke his leg. Despite this, he raised his knife and shouted, "Sic semper tyrannis," literally meaning, "thus always to tyrants," in Latin. Some witnesses claim they heard him add, "the South was avenged," at the end, but others swore that he only said "sic semper tyrannis" before going on stage. At first, the audience thought that this was like a part of the show. They thought maybe this was like a crazy character, like an American guy during this British, sort of comedy. They didn't understand what was happening until Mary Lincoln started to scream. As chaos erupted, an army officer named Major Joseph Stewart was sitting in the front row and jumped on stage and actually chased Booth during the commotion. Booth also slashed the orchestra leader, William Withers Jr. Now, it's also worth noting that at this exact show, it was actually full of a lot of different military personnel. Again, this was a popular theater in D.C., the war was basically over, and a lot of people wanted to see it. So there was a ton of active military in the theater, all the high-ranking generals, etc. So eventually, Booth makes it outside, and he made his way to the stables to find the stable worker holding his horse. He pushes him out of the way, jumps on his horse, and rides away into the night, heading for Maryland. Once everyone realizes what had happened, Charles Leal, a young Union Army surgeon, made his way to the door of the presidential box, but he couldn't get it open until Rathbone noticed the wooden brace that Booth had actually used to jam the door shut. When inside, Leal and a bystander named William Kent cut away Lincoln's collar, unbuttoned his shirt, looking for what they thought was a stab wound. Once Leal located the gunshot wound behind his ear, he realized that the bullet was too deep to remove. Knowing Lincoln couldn't survive a bumpy carriage ride to the White House, Leal decided to move him to the nearest house on 10th Street. So, 7 men carefully carried the president outside in the pouring rain. When they made it outside, the man pointed them to the home of a local tailor named William Peterson, just across the street. Inside, there was only a small first-floor bedroom, and Lincoln, being too tall for the bed, was actually laid diagonally across it. And once the whole room was cleared, even of Mrs. Lincoln, the doctors examined the president for other injuries, and they found none. They applied, hot water bottles and cloths and blankets to warm up his body, but they all agreed that Lincoln would not survive. And the very next morning, April 15th, Lincoln died at 7:22 a.m. But remember, Abraham Lincoln wasn't the only person that was involved in this plot. Booth wasn't the only one who was supposed to be attacking. His partner, Lewis Powell, was carrying out his part of the plan across town, killing the Secretary of State, William Seward, who was actually recovering from a almost deadly carriage ride incident 9 days earlier and was just bedridden in his home on Lafayette Square. So at 10:10 p.m., at the same time that Booth entered Lincoln's box, Powell and David Harold arrived at the Seward house. Powell was carrying an 1858 Whitney revolver and a bow. When he knocked on the door, Seward's servant, William Bell, answered. Powell claimed he was delivering medicine from the doctor and had to show Secretary Seward personally how to take it. The servant kind of hesitated, but then eventually let him inside. At the top of the stairs, Powell was stopped again by Seward's son, Assistant Secretary Frederick Seward, asking him what he was doing in their house. He then repeated the medicine story, but Frederick told him that his father was asleep. And just at that moment, Seward's daughter, Fanny, poked her head out of the door and said, "Fred, father's awake." Powell then turned as if to leave, then suddenly swung back, drawing his revolver aimed at Frederick's forehead and pulled the trigger. But the crazy thing is that the gun misfired. Powell then smashed the pistol into Frederick's skull, knocked him unconscious, and charged into Seward's bedroom. Fanny screamed as Powell attacked the secretary, slashing him across the face and the neck, but miraculously, a jaw splint saved Seward's life by blocking the blade from actually reaching his jugular vein. Still, the wounds were gruesome and his face would be scarred for life. Hearing the screams, Seward's other son, Augustus, and Sergeant Jordan Robinson burst into the room, and both were stabbed while trying to protect the Secretary of State. As Augustus went for the pistol, Powell fled downstairs, stabbing a State Department messenger, and retained so from the door. When he made it outside, he allegedly shouted, I'm mad," and he vanished into the dark. Now, remember that guy Harold that I told you about, like the getaway guy? He was basically tasked with taking Powell to Seward's location. Well, he was terrified by the noise and all the screaming and thought that he would get caught, so he just bolted and basically left Powell completely alone. But while Booth was fleeing the theater and Powell's knife was basically slashing into the Seward residence, another man was supposed to strike, but never did. Now, this guy, George Atzerodt, was assigned to kill Vice President Andrew Johnson. Johnson was staying at the Kirkwood House Hotel in Washington, and Booth's plan was basically for Atzerodt to knock on Johnson's door, stab him, and then leave. Pretty straightforward. But Atzerodt, as we probably can tell, is not really built for murder, right? Again, this is like a German immigrant who doesn't really speak a ton of English, and was maybe not as much of an ideologue. He was kind of entranced by John Wilkes Booth's fame. So earlier that day, he checked into a room directly above Johnson's, but by nighttime, he was getting nervous. And he was getting so nervous that instead of approaching Johnson's room, he went downstairs to the bar, pistol and knife tucked into his coat, and just wanted to have a drink, just to kind of, take the edge off. And then he does maybe the dumbest thing ever done in assassination attempt history. He starts to ask the bartender questions about the Vice President Johnson, and just asking about his character, his habits, what kind of guy he was, almost like he was trying to convince himself that the Vice President deserved it. But the alcohol didn't make him brave, it just sort of made him sloppy. And he ended up getting so drunk and walking the streets, and somewhere along the way, he threw his knife into a gutter, and then ended up renting another hotel room and fell asleep. Now what's crazy is that John Wilkes Booth actually stopped by the Kirkwood Hotel himself and left a cryptic note at the front desk intended for Vice President Johnson. And it literally read, "Don't wish to disturb you. Are you at home? J. Wilkes Booth." Historians still debate to this day why he did this, but some think that Booth was checking if Johnson would actually be there, while others believed that maybe he wanted to frame the Vice President, essentially planting like a breadcrumb that would make people suspicious as to why the Vice President was in contact with, Southern, sympathizers and conspirators, maybe making it look like the Vice President was the one that wanted Abraham Lincoln to die so he could become president. But even though we don't know the actual motive, one thing is certain, that night changed America. So about half an hour after shooting Abraham Lincoln, President of the United States, Booth was crossing the Navy Yard Bridge into Maryland when a Union soldier named Silas Cobb stopped him for traveling out of curfew. But Booth said that he was heading home to Charles County, so Cobb just let him go. And about an hour later, David Harold crossed the same bridge, giving basically the same excuse. The two men met up and they stopped by Mary Surratt's Tavern in Surrattsville. There, they collected their guns and their supplies that they cached there earlier that they could take them while they were on the run. From there, they rode through the night to Dr. Seymour Mudd's farm. Now, this is the man that Booth had actually met John Surratt. This is the guy that actually connected them. Now, remember, Booth's leg is broken this entire time, since he jumped off the balcony onto the stage at Ford's Theater. So Dr. Mudd actually fixed the fracture, made him some crutches, and let him rest there until the following day. Now, after leaving the Mudds, Booth and Harold were guided to the homes of Samuel Cox and Thomas Jones, both Confederate sympathizers. Jones hid them for 5 days in the Zekiah swamp, and he brought them food and newspapers the whole time while they were hiding out. And Booth was actually surprised to read the newspapers, because he was expecting that people would love him, they would adore him, he thought that they would see him as a guy that saved America. But instead, the general public, both in the North and even in the South, saw him as a criminal. And in his mind, he was a hero. He was embodying Brutus, and he felt as if he was saving the Confederacy and saving America, the same way that Brutus saved Rome from Julius Caesar, the tyrant. And he wrote, "For doing what Brutus was honored for, and yet I, for striking down a greater tyrant than they ever knew, and looked upon as a common cutthroat." He couldn't believe it. He literally thought, I'm going to do this, and I'm going to be revered as a hero. I'm going to be beloved, even greater than my brother Edwin, more than my father. I will be seen as the man that took down the greatest tyrant America ever saw. That's how much of a committed, sort of racist ideologue John Wilkes Booth was. So by April 24th, John Wilkes Booth had been a fugitive for 10 days. His broken leg had been splinted and kind of prepared and healed up by Dr. Mudd, but all the walking through the swamps and getting dirty made his leg way worse, and it actually caused them to stop consistently along the way. And after spending several nights in the woods, the two finally crossed the Potomac River into Virginia and arrived at the farm of Richard Garrett near Port Royal. Now, Booth introduced himself under the alias Boyd, claiming to be a wounded Confederate soldier returning home. Now, Garrett's sons believed his story and actually offered them shelter in their tobacco barn on the back part of their property. Now, Booth reportedly bragged about his time in the Confederate Army, claiming that his wound was from being shot by Union soldiers, but 2 days later, on April 26th, the Garretts started to get a little bit suspicious, and for the right reasons. Around 2 a.m., Union cavalry surrounded the Garrett farm, and they entered the home, and they pulled John Garrett from his bed at gunpoint, and they asked him who is in their barn, who do they hide there? And John told them that it was just 2 strangers, but the soldiers then forced the entire family outside to question him. Harold saw from the barn and started begging Booth to let him leave, saying that he didn't want to die. Booth then told him to just leave and called him a coward. When Harold surrendered, he was immediately taken into custody, but Booth wanted to stay in the barn. He wanted a shootout. He stayed there with his carbine and a pistol and refused to leave. After several warnings, the soldiers surrounded the barn, and they actually set fire to it to basically get him to run out. They wanted him to surrender, to leave, and they were going to capture him. But Booth never ran. So as the fire grew, Sergeant Boston Corbett fired a single shot through the gap in the wall, and it hit Booth in the neck. It shattered his spine, and it paralyzed him. He was then pulled from the burning barn and laid in the grass. He reportedly asked a soldier to raise his hands so that he could see them. And when the soldier did, Booth said, "Useless, useless." He died a few hours later, around 7 a.m., at the age of 26. His body was carried back to Washington, D.C., and identified by several people, including his doctor and a photographer who had known him for years. Booth's remains were initially buried at a secret grave at the old penitentiary in the Washington Arsenal, but years later his family was allowed to move him to Greenmount Cemetery in Baltimore, where he is to this day. So, they got John Wilkes Booth, the bad guy, is gone, but there are all the other accomplices. So, there was an investigation that was led forward by Secretary Edwin Stanton, who made it very clear anyone connected to Booth would be found and punished. Within days, dozens of people were arrested, but 5 names stood out: Lewis Powell, George Atzerodt, David Harold, oddly enough, Mary Surratt, and Dr. Samuel Mudd. Now, after Powell's attack on Seward, he ran away, leaving his force behind, and for 3 days he hid in the woods outside Washington, but he eventually made his way back to Mary Surratt's boarding house, the same place where the assassination plot had actually been planned, and the same woman and son that actually facilitated their escape. Inside, Mary was already being questioned by Union soldiers on the whereabouts of the other accomplices, but she claimed that she had no part in anything, and she didn't know anyone, and she had no involvement at all. But just at that moment, Powell arrived at the door, still covered in Seward's blood, and walked inside. The soldiers grabbed him, they started questioning him about where he'd been, and he basically said that Mrs. Surratt sent him to go dig a ditch, but that's when the detectives noticed his bloody hands, and they asked who he was. At that moment, Powell froze, and Mrs. Surratt panicked, and they both sealed their fates. Powell and Mary were then tackled to the ground and arrested on the spot. Atzerodt is the one who never followed through. He sort of just got too drunk and nervous and, ditched his knife. And investigators basically learned that Atzerodt had rented a room at the Kirkwood and left behind a revolver, a Bowie knife, and a map of Virginia. All the evidence you really need. From there, they traced him to his cousin's home, Hartman Richter, and his farm at Germantown, about 20 miles away. And there, soldiers surrounded the property. Atzerodt tried to hide in the attic, but a search party found him under a pile of straw. When confronted, he broke down immediately and confessed that he was a part of, the Booth group, and that basically, he said that, he was too big of a coward to do his job. He was then arrested and taken back to Washington. Now, Harold's story ended at Garrett's farm, but after being captured, he was kept aboard the USS Montauk, where he was interrogated for days. He tried to portray himself as, an innocent follower. He didn't really know what he was doing. He was a boy who had simply done what Booth told him to do, but that didn't work out for him, clearly. Now, Dr. Samuel Mudd's involvement may be the weirdest. His connection became obvious once detectives started to retrace, Booth's steps and learned that locals had mentioned a wounded man who had stopped at the home of a country doctor. When troops arrived at Mudd's farm near Bryantown, Maryland, they began interrogating him. Mudd claimed that he had treated an injured stranger who gave the name Booth, but insisted he didn't recognize the famous actor. But the lie didn't hold up. When investigators began searching Mudd's home, they found a pair of men's riding boots with J. Wilkes carved inside the leather. And when showed the evidence, Mudd basically broke down and admitted to having lied about Booth's identity. He was then arrested and transported to Washington to join the other prisoners. And then by early May, all of the major conspirators were in custody, and Stanton ordered that they be tried before a military commission, not a civilian court. And they argued that Lincoln's assassination was an act of war. So the trial began on May 9th, 1865, and lasted for several weeks, with more than 360 witnesses testifying. And on July 6th, the tribunal sentenced Powell, Harold, Atzerodt, and Mary Surratt to death. The executions took place at 1:26 p.m. the very next day in the courtyard of the Washington Arsenal prison, with roughly 1,000 people lined up to watch. Mary Surratt was brought out first, wearing a black dress and a veil. It said that she whispered to the guards and said her final words, "Please don't let me fall." Lewis Powell stood by her. His priest told him he was going to a better life, and witnesses even noted that he adjusted the noose on himself before the hood went on. David Harold was next. He was terrified and had to be helped up the steps. When the hood was placed over his head, he simply just said, "Goodbye." George Atzerodt was the last on the scaffold. He was visibly terrified and recited prayers. His final words, spoken just before the drop, were, "May we meet in another world. God take me now." At precisely 1:26 p.m., the executioner, Captain Rath, clapped his hands and a single lever dropped. All 4 conspirators died. Surratt died almost immediately, but the men struggled for several minutes before going still. The officer noted in his log that the drop was 6 feet, death by strangulation certain.